Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the series premiere of Chapelwaite. Great series premiere. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I wasn't expecting that opening. Obviously finding out that Charles' father went nuts, strangled his wife, Charles's mom, and then tried to kill him because it's about he's like, oh, where's the boy? And it seems like he was trying, like he's not all there, but then he's talking about basically almost like blood has to be paid with blood, and like a worm is coming, and he whacks Charles with a shovel and was going to bury him, but then ultimately Charles' mom wasn't dead, so she killed him, and we don't really get too much insight other than hard cut to 33 years later because Charles' mother was like, you have to leave and never come back. So, because that was in Massachusetts. So, as he I don't know if that's the thing of he's avoided home and all that time, or is it in general he's avoided land for living on land for too long, because it seems like this all stems from the Boone family in general. I guess it's if you take up roots anywhere for very long periods of time, you're doomed to fall prey to that family curse, because even his wife is dying and she's like, right, your cousin leaving that place to you, bequeathing it to you, well, that kind of wasn't, I don't think, much of his choice, but you get what I'm trying to say. She said it's more of a blessing. I know you don't want to, but we could it could be a place for the kids to roots, because it's they need foundation like that. But I'm so I was wondering, did they grow up? At very least, did he grow up and spend most of his time out on the sea? He is the captain of the ship, but I'm curious, is that trying to imply he's never set down roots permanently on land? He's always made it, it's always right, I'll settle down here and there. Because we hear about it later on, but he's the reason why his wife and his children are on the boat with him, because he convinced them to leave the island. Whether it's they spent their entire lives on a boat, because it seems like that, because it's right, they have to get adjusted to living on either they were small when they left, or maybe it was a periodic thing of oh, you come back, so the kids have some experience on land, but not much, very little. They spent almost their entire lives out on the sea. I don't know, but yeah, we find out this Chapelwaite is the name of the property that was left to him by his cousin Stephen. He's which I didn't know Stephen that well. It's actually really tragic when you find out about Stephen's circumstances, because it's she basically, the caretaker who was oh, I thought of Stephen as a son. He died of grief, which even Charles was we all have grief, but not enough to die from it. It's well, he had his daughter Marcella ended up falling down the stairs to the cellar and ended up breaking her back, and he found her and was so devastated. What she ended up leaving out is the fact is that Stephen hung himself, even to the point the constable is yeah, you should have seen the town's look of glee. The fact is, you might not want to stick around. You might want to sell that property, because the town was almost gleeful that he died, because the town hates the Boone family, because they're kind of considered a plague, a curse upon the town. That property of Chapelwaite is considered that in general. It's kind of a cursed place, so people stay away from it. It's already bad enough being a Boone, his children being different, not, as the dude says, non-white. So there's that on top of it. You're a Boone, plus you look different, so that family's got issues all across the board. The only person in town that's really taken an interest in them is Rebecca, who is played by Emily Hampshire, which I saw her name. I was dude, because I had to look at it, because I was oh, that name looks so familiar, and I looked into it, and I was oh my god, it's Jennifer from 12 Monkeys, which, if you don't know anything, I love 12 Monkeys. It's one of, if not my favorite science fictional show. It fluctuates a little bit, because it's up there, because it's such a great show, but also I love her. She's probably one of my favorite characters. Her character of Jennifer was probably my favorite character in the show. She's so good. She's so good. So I was so super pumped to find out that she was in the show. I was that's so awesome. But also it's also I should bring it up. Charles is played by Adrian Brody, which I'm is this the first TV show Adrian Brody's done? I mean, I'm not well versed in all of his filmography anyway, but I'm curious if this is the first time he's done television. I know it's over the years, because there's always been that stigma of oh, if you're a movie actor, going to TV's where your career goes to die, or even going to video games is where your career goes to die, that type of thing. Obviously, a lot of that shifted. I think it's still there a little bit, but I don't think it's as that disparagement of going to TV. I don't think it's there as much because a lot of that's like changed over the years. And regardless, that's just me going on a tangent. So, but just seeing him in the show was kind of interesting. I'm like, because I don't think I've ever seen him in anything. Like, he might have had smaller parts and stuff that I'm just not aware of. Regardless, like I said, tangents and all that aside. But it's also a creepy property in general, the Chapelwaite, because not only is Stevens buried there, his daughter Marcella, as well as his dad Philip, is buried there as well. And interesting enough, because I was curious like how much of his past he's told his children, and it's like, oh, what about your dad? You don't really talk about much. He's like, yeah, my dad was kind of, basically Charles is kind of like, my dad was an oddball, he was a little weird, I'll kind of leave it at that. It's like, yeah, you don't want to talk about your extremely messed up childhood where your dad tried to kill your mom and that your mom had to kill you. So it's like, you might as well bury that past, because it's like, that darkness is there, and you'd probably rather not expose your children to it. But regardless, I went on a bit of a tangent, but I did say Rebecca. I do believe her name is Rebecca. I think her last name's like Morgan. But if I, like I said, could be a complete idiot and I'm getting it wrong, but I do believe it was Rebecca. What's interesting is like her interest in the Boones, in particular this family, is because they are what they are. Like they are this cursed family, but also it's because she's writing like an article, or something, wasn't it, for like The Atlantic or something, like or a story, and she's got some ideas, as she said, like 100 bad ones, not any good ones, but they present an opportunity. So she presents herself as like, hey, I can be your caretaker, because the previous like caretaker, she was like, no, I'm not stepping foot back in this house. Now that Steven's gone, I'm not, like, she knows there's something off about the property, but I don't know whether she really knows, or just because of all the death that's been in there, just because of like, oh, I mean, who knows how far that's going back in the history of that place. Like, we know, like I said, Steven, his dad, and his daughter are buried there, but beyond that, we don't know, like, if there's even more Boones, because I think there were other graves in that property. Those are the three they focus on. They might be the only ones, but I would assume they would, like, that's probably passed down generation after generation. That's also why I was like, it's not like Steven necessarily left this property to him on purpose, because it was like, right, the property went to them, but it's like, shouldn't it go to his daughter? And it's like, well, Steven's daughter died, passed away. Like, he tried to, like, because dying is a little, it's kind of like, ugh, but passing away makes it sound a little more peaceful and not just the very brutal way apparently she died. Which immediately in my head, I'm like, it wasn't an accident, was it? Like, Steven went crazy and killed her, didn't he? Just because, like, I don't know, it could have been an accident, but, like, Charles went down to the cellar earlier to check things out, and, like, he saw, like, what looked like where she fell, because it was, like, a dried spot of blood, like, where she, and I'm like, because it seems like the crazy kind of runs in that family, because it seems like that family's cursed, but he also found, like, a tub bin with, like, straps that you find, like, the type of straps they'd be using to, like, tie down a patient in, like, an asylum or something. And I'm like, that's weird. And even he was kind of thinking, that's weird. And then there was also the worms, which one fell down on him. Like, we never saw where that went. I'm like, it could have just been like, oh, it's just a worm. But I'm like, all this talk of worms, and later on, he's in the bathtub and he sees, like, that, like, dirt pile and all those worms. I'm like, worms are going to be significant, which I'm like, because I think even in the trailer, that's what you see him at the beginning, like, pulling out of his nose. I think that's worms. I'm like, is it kind of like an eerie thing manifesting itself like this, and these attack your brain and make you crazy? Like, is there like a legitimate, like, oh, like, what this property's built off of, and these things get inside your head and eat your brain, kind of like, it's kind of weird to go realistic, but like bacteria, like those type of, like, amoeba that can eat your brain, like, is it something like that till it drives you insane? So is there kind of like a scientific, but also like an element of this property is there, and it just kind of like, no one knows that there's this thing going on with the property doing that to you, or does it seem like it is a supernatural thing? And I think that's the point of it too. Like, there is the line between the supernatural and just plain you going crazy. Those lines blur so easily, so it's hard to say what's going on, because at first he's like, oh, there must be rats or something, and then one of his daughters like listens and is like, I don't hear anything, and it's like, he's like, basically he's like, oh, this is them being smart. So he brought someone here, and the dude's like, I can't find anything. It's like, well, I heard the rats, so keep looking. And it's like, are you just being crazy? Obviously, because of All Hallows Eve, Rebecca tried to, like, because she did go to college and she is educated enough. The kids have learned a lot from their mom, but she's like, oh, let me teach you all the stuff I've learned, which involved All Hallows Eve, and, which I'm like, oh, did it really not just, I guess it took much later before it incorporated just straight up candy, because she was like, oh, you'll get something and food. I'm like, oh, it's just food, it's not even candy. I guess like the candy situation came about much later in like history or whatever. It's fascinating. It's always fascinating like to know like where like holidays and like traditions started and how much they've shifted over the years to become what they are. Because it's like, oh, you can dress up and stuff like that, but then also like the fact is it's straight up food that you get, not just necessarily candy. And like, you know, that's, I think if it was just like sweets or candies, they would have said that instead of using a specific term of food. So I thought that was interesting. Like I said, could be me like thinking too much about it and over like, it might be a lot more simple of like food is a ergo candy, or I just, like I said, I just think of legitimate food when you're saying food and not just candy. But regardless, I think it was kind of poor judgment on her part to be like, oh, let me show you this ritual that's kind of my favorite where you can commune with the dead and stuff, and if you catch the spirit or whatever, they can have to grant you a wish, but if it's the spirit you know, you can talk to them. Like, knowing that they lost their mom, it's been like a little over 8 months, because as I was like, the moment's like 8 months, they lost their mom 8 months. I was like, that was 8 months ago. I was like, oh, makes sense. You're traveling by boat. I don't know what I expected. It's like, oh, I expected faster. It's like, no, it's in a video game. This ain't fast travel. It's like, yeah, it's gonna take them 8 months to voyage there. But I thought it was I just, like I said, I think it was just like poor judgment on her part to do that. But it's like she just wanted to impart like what she knew to them. But even she recognizes later, like, yeah, that was kind of poor mistake on my part. Obviously, like those birds they were talking about, because the lady in like at the beginning of the episode was like, huh, those things are out. They're usually not out during the day. One like happens to run into the window at the time. The cellar's unlocked, even though the cellar was supposed to be locked, which they chalk it up to, oh, the guy that was here to look for the rats and stuff, he must have left it unlocked. It's like, because obviously it's like heeding the housekeeper's warning previously, like, oh yeah, because of what happened to Marcella, you might want to keep that locked. Not a place for children. So I was also scared for Rebecca because she was heading towards the cellar. I was like, oh, please don't go down there. Please don't go down there. But she didn't. Luckily, it's just kind of like, oh, it must be us. Like, we're letting this game. It's nothing more than a game. It's like, we're letting it get to the best of us. So let me just forget this to happen and just close it. I was like, okay, good. And the last thing you want to probably go down there. That would have been a whole bunch of issues. But, she's also the one that suggested that they go to church, because she knows what it's like to, you know, even, yeah, she does not, she's not all about the church, especially because it's like, right, like, basically it tells a woman what her place is supposed to be, and it's not the best place for the free-thinking woman, but it's kind of like, right, I know what it's like to be different in a small town like this. By going to church, you know, your children are different, they're wonderful, I see them for who they really are, but not the rest of the town is, so it'd probably be best to blend in, especially, once again, it doesn't help you being a boon and everything. But, you know, Charles agreed, and they go. But then, like, the father who owned you, he's like, oh, like, the lady, it's like, yeah, my father used to own a church. He wants to kind of talk to you. It's like, yeah, so there's not enough seats, especially for some of our older, you know, people who come, and it's like, oh, well, we don't mind standing. It's like, that's not the problem. And it's like, are your children Christian and stuff like that? And he's like, well, if basically they're as much or as little Christian as they want to be. But it's like, just because of his family nature, it's like, me and my family came here for like a fresh start. That's all we wanted. We're not here to cause any trouble. It's like, regardless, I'm sorry for you, but your family is a plague on this town. You're not welcome here. And they bounce. And it's like, ugh. I mean, once again, like, don't forget what I brought up earlier about the whole constable being like, oh yeah, like everyone was excited when they found out your cousin hung himself. But Rebecca kind of explains a little bit more about why that is, because basically the property of Chapelwaite is considered the cause of like the sickness and plague that is, well, lack of a better term, plaguing this town, because it started off with two stable hands who got sick and died, but then like that was 2 years ago, but subsequently since like 5 have died. There's even that dude in town, his daughter is sick, like, because there's the whole quarantine sign in front of their house, and so, which that little girl was kind of creepy. She's like, oh, my rabbit's dead, like, did you do it? Because she was talking to like Charles' little son, and it was like, oh, that was creepy as hell. But even, it doesn't help that Charles kind of went to the meal and was telling those guys, like, yo, basically, this is your severance pay, get to work. You know, basically, like, the more work you do, the more, like, you saw at the meal or whatever, the better pay you get type of thing of, like, yeah, things are kind of slacking off a little bit. So, because he was looking through the books earlier, and he was talking to the dude who did the books, and there was the thing of like Jerusalem's Lot, and I'm like, what is that about? Like, he gets like, he points, or at least he tells Charles about it, which I'm like, okay, like obviously you see that in the intro, and obviously if you knew about it, or if you missed it in the intro, or you're not unaware, this is based on a Stephen King book, specifically a short story called Jerusalem's Lot. That's why I was like, okay, so what, maybe that, because that's what I think is interesting, like why isn't it just called Jerusalem's Lot? Why is it called Chapelwaite? Like, I'm just curious about that. I've never read the story. I've never actually read any Stephen King book. I've seen a lot of adaptations, like It. I've seen the, like, 90s It, and I've seen the first rebooted It. I haven't seen the part 2 yet. God, what else Stephen King related? I've seen tiny bits of Misery. God, there's another. I've watched The Langoliers years ago. I watched The Stand years ago. I've not seen the more recent one. I've seen like the older one. Regardless, tangents and all that aside, like that's just what I was just kind of going on. Oh yeah, The Mist, both the movie and the short-lived TV show adaptation. But regardless of that, that's what, like, the distinguishment like between titles like that I thought was interesting. Even because I was like, oh, maybe they decided to change it. It's like, no, because there's a place in this called Jerusalem's Lot. Then I'm like, then what? Why didn't they just go ahead and call it Jerusalem's Lot? Why Chapelwaite? Maybe there's significance to that. Maybe it's like, maybe because it's something they've changed for the show, that's why, like, Chapelwaite ends up being the focus. Maybe Jerusalem's Lot is the focus in the short stories, or maybe, I don't know. But regardless, before I went on that whole tangent, my point was going to be like, yeah, like, I'm sure he definitely didn't make many friends at that at the mill doing all of that, especially that one major dude being like, oh, like, because one guy was talking mad smack. It's like, oh, you know, because of the sickness, it's like you have to burn. Like, he's like, when my father got sick, they told me to burn everything that maybe like clothes, the bed, or whatever. So what we should do is burn down the Boones, like home or whatever. And that dude in particular, he was the main worker there, slides a lighter over. He's like, you want to do it, because he's all about it. Because it's like, yeah, that guy challenged me and made me look stupid and made me feel small. Burns house down for all I care, but home dude didn't do it. It's to do with the sick daughter who decides to do it, because everyone blames that place. Like, that was the whole point, you know. Rebecca doesn't believe it because she's like, if there was like proof of it, I wouldn't be working here. I wouldn't be staying here right now if that were the case. But to be fair, it's also because you find it so fascinating because there's a mystery here. You're trying to figure out not only the property itself, but you think by diving into like the Boones in general, maybe you can find out more about why the family is kind of cursed the way they are. Because it does seem like it is something that specifically affects the males of the family. I'm curious if Stephen's father, Philip, had that whole thing, but the fact is that it's like, oh, just grief, the reason why Stephen killed himself. Like, maybe there was more to it. Maybe there were voices. Maybe what made him potentially kill his daughter. Or maybe she did just straight up die and he just got driven insane. But I'm like, I think he got driven insane, killed, or got driven even more insane because of the grief and just anguish of what he did, and then killed himself because it was the only way to make it stop. I don't know. Because, I mean, because it's interesting because it doesn't seem like it is just tied to the property, because we saw what happened to his dad, and it's like, you know, so I don't know. And that's also, I think that's also like, right, this is in Maine too. I'm like, oh yeah, because I think that's supposed to be the, like, is all of Stephen King's stories set in Maine? Oh yeah, I forgot about, thinking about that, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about Haven. I mean, that's like loosely based on a Colorado kid, but it's still like loosely based on like a Stephen King property. I love Haven. If you've never seen that, I recommend you check it out. Might still be on Netflix, I think. Like I said, I've never read the book. What I know of the book, very different. Very, very, very different. There's like actually very loose like connections between the books. So it's a very loose adaptation. So, you know, maybe this might be kind of in that similar vein, or maybe this is a lot closer of an adaptation than a lot, you know, in comparison. Regardless. What I think is also interesting too is that his youngest daughter is definitely picking up on it, because she's the one that's quiet. Like, she hasn't spoken since their mom died. But at the church, he kind of snapped on her. He's like, we're going, and he grabbed her arm, and he's like apologizing to her. And he even says, like, I know you blame me for your mom getting sick. She would have never gotten sick if I didn't take you guys off the island, didn't take her off the island. And your leg wouldn't be the way it is either. But he's like, your mom you know, basically was talking about, I believe, like how she believed that this could be an opportunity for them. So he's like, and I miss her. Like, you know, I know you miss her. I miss her too. And she hugs her dad, and she says like, you're hiding something from us inside of yourself. And she's like, that's what scares me. Because I think in that moment, it came out. Like, Charles has been scared. I think he's spent his entire life being scared, especially becoming a parent, probably worried that he was going to, like, whatever plagued his father would happen to him. And then I think that was something like his wife had talked to him about at the beginning too. And like, oh, you're not your father. Like, don't worry about it. But I think in that moment, he can be like, hearing her say that, it probably made him go like, right, I did lose my temper. Like, I think he's probably afraid to do that because he's like, what if that, like, what, it's something I'm predisposed to. It's something there that's sinister, maybe evil in us. Like, people say all this stuff about the Boone family, but like, maybe it's like the reason why he reacts the way he does is because he knows firsthand that there is something there. He just wants to hope that it's not. Maybe it's not just a Boone thing, but it's like, right, hearing about what happened to its cousin, which once again that could just be like, oh, the grief of losing his daughter drove him insane, but there might be more to that tale. But also like dealing with his father, like there's just a lot, and I'm sure we have to go back and further into Boone family history, and maybe we'll kind of do that over the course of the series. But aside from all of that, there is the guy who was planning to come burn the property down, and that dude rolls up with the hammer, kills the whore at single strike, bashes the dude, slits his throat, and then like bleeds him in like blood into the bucket. I'm like, what are you collecting that for? Okay. Because at first I was trying to get a good look. I was like, I don't think it's Charles, but then I was like, I don't think you get a good enough look. They purposely keep the camera like super far away, but didn't just stop there by slicing the dude's throat. Got to get rid of the evidence by like burning his body, because it'd be like, I guess it's like to hide the evidence of who it is. It's like, well, he'll have disappeared, but they won't be able to prove that it's him. I don't know. Maybe trying to also hide the fact is that she bled him a little bit. Maybe that's what you're also trying to hide. At first I'm like, because at first I was like, is it Charles? Is he doing that because he went a little insane? Or is that going to be like Stephen or Philip, like the ghost of them? Because like, is it like the property of Chapelwaite trying to fight back? Is it 1408? Based on a Stephen King book? I'm trying to remember. I know the movie is Samuel L. Jackson and John Cusack. I'm trying to remember. I think that's based on it. I could be full of it. I feel like that might be a Stephen King thing. The reason why I was referencing it, because I'm like, is it kind of like that? Like, obviously, like I said, it's a cursed bloodline, but it's also like a cursed property that the property, like, basically summoned its guardian angel, or rather its guardian devil, to protect the property. It's like, oh, you've come here with the intent to destroy this property, or do, I wonder, is it specifically the Boone family harm, or is it more so about dealing damage to the property? Maybe it's one and the same, and decided like, oh, we're going to kill you. Like I said, bleeding him, it seems like a ritual type of thing. What that'll turn into, I have no idea, but it is interesting that at like around the same time that's happening, you know, Charles dives deeper into the tub, and then he comes up and he sees the dirt and the worms, and he's remembering his father's story about the worms. And I'm like, could that be what that is? That thing? Like, could that person have been the worm that his father spoke about all those years ago? Like I said, maybe it's an entity or something that's been following the Boone bloodline that's tied to them in some shape or form. A lot of interesting things. Kind of I feel like, I don't mean this in a bad way, but it is kind of a slow burn of a start in some regards. But I am interested to see where all of this ultimately ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.